gentlemen, because you know what? Here we are. It's Data Day. I want to get to Data Day. And, as I danced a little bit in the background for y'all. Welcome to Sales Chatter, the podcast where we aim to help 10,000 sales reps generate $1 million GP in under 12 months. I'm your host today, Dan Deigan. Ryan is still having some conflict issues with getting here in the morning. Hopefully it'll be in the comments, y'all. But next week we're back to normal. So we only got a couple more days. We all got to stare at this ugly mug instead of Ryan's cool quaff for the next couple of days. But today is Data Day, y'all. We're going to talk about the end of produce season, what some of these strikes are, it's happening, and how the market is panning out for the next couple of months. And of course, we got a guru, Dean, with us today. Dean, how are you, my man?
Yeah, good. Good to be
I
with
hear
you.
the birds in the background. That's nice. That's pretty calming.
Them would be seagulls here on the ocean.
Oh, them would be seagulls. Mine.
Yeah.
Finding Nemo. Remember that? All right. And we got our main man, Jeff Dickinson, back again. Jeff, how are you, brother?
Good, my man. Looking forward to this segment, especially what's happening with yellow. I'd like to touch base on that too. I think it's very pertinent to our conversations.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that are going to be, if one happens or a few happen, it's going to be a massively different conversation in as little as a few days. You know what I mean? Like it's changing that quick. So, Dean, before we get into that, let's start with the end of produce season and kind of what you're seeing there. What was the year over year? Where we're at, and we'll kind of lead into it from that point. Right?
Yes, slow start, strong finish. Some of the industry pundits called it, was going to be a non-event. I think we've always been pretty consistent in saying that produce season would happen. It was a very late start. It could possibly last a little bit longer than July 4. The jury's still out on that one. We don't know. Typically, volumes fall right off. Like I looked at the data this morning. The number of truckloads of produce that moves within the next 4 weeks will drop by about 25% compared to what it was last week. So it's a steep drop-off in volume as everyone goes on vacation. So, and then we go into what we call maintenance mode. I call it maintenance mode because that's kind of what the reefer market is like between now and Thanksgiving. You see a little bit of activity around Halloween with pumpkins moving, but most of those can move in vented trailers without too many reefer requirements. But you really don't see reefer rates move again until Thanksgiving. In fact, 3 weeks out from Thanksgiving when fresh turkeys start moving. So for 143 days from July 4 to Thanksgiving, it's what I call maintenance mode, where there's not a lot of strong signals. There's no major events on the social calendar that would create demand like Mother's Day does, like Independence July 4 does, all those sorts of things. So produce season did happen. Volumes were comparable with this time last year. They're in fact a little bit higher. And so we did end on a strong note. Yeah, we were a long way behind. Remember, the caveat was always when we get the full 6 months of reporting in, including California citrus, there was time to catch up. Well, it did catch up. The problem is that the number of truckloads, when you cram the same number of truckloads into a shorter period of time, what you ended up with was some pretty high rates out of some of the growing regions for produce carriers, and people in the broking 3PL space reported very tight capacity, which is kind of odd because rates weren't that good everywhere else unless you're hauling refrigerated produce, because that's a really specialized market, as you guys know. You got to have.
Well, it kind of like reminds me of last year with flatbeds when prices on dry vans started dropping. Flatbeds were still rising, right?
Yeah, you know what? It's just like supply and demand theory, right?
Yeah. Well,
but it's always the specialized markets where you see that kind of lift, right? And it doesn't lift the general freight market, FAK market, if you will, of typical dry vans, even dry van freight and reefers, all that kind of stuff.
A lot of our brokers require a 3-year-old or newer refrigerated trailer to haul produce, right? So think about all the people that have joined the industry in the last few years. I can almost guarantee you haven't bought a very shiny, expensive trailer to do that. So it's a very specialized niche, is the specialized produce hauler. You can spot them on the roads. They have a very distinctive look. They're very profitable carriers. They've got they are beautiful. It's beautiful equipment. But they run on average, when you look at the USDA rates, it's about $1.30 a mile higher than the national average for all temperatures. So when you look at frozen ice cream, produce, everything that's refrigerated, when you take that sliver of fruit and veg and those high-value loads of cherries or peaches, that average rate is at least $1 a mile higher, a little bit higher in some markets than the national average. So that's why you see capacity get pretty tight in some of those markets, because the number of carriers that can haul that produce shrinks dramatically.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Like Jeff said, supply and demand. It's the whole industry is supply and demand.
But the big shift though was away from California. This year was a notable shift. Volumes were down. So if I said volumes were down 30% year over year in California, they were up by that out of Mexico. So that's why the totality of our produce season is sort of on par with last year. But the big thing was the shift. And a lot of volume coming across what typically would be fairly small reefer markets like Nogales, Arizona, which runs straight up. I think it was at 15, 17. Can't remember the number. Runs straight into Tucson, connects to the 8 into San Diego, connects on the 10 into the 40. Once you get to Nogales, you can cover that western side of the US pretty quickly. So it's a high volume lane where a lot of produce came across. The other ones are El Paso and McAllen. McAllen in the southern Texas market, in the Rio Grande Valley, that's where the majority of produce comes across. It's the closest to where a lot of produce is grown in central Mexico. So we saw that big shift. Rates were pretty good out of some of those markets. So I don't think carriers had a bad year in the produce market. I think brokers would have been able to find capacity at a price. I think there was, generally, the USDA didn't report, a shortage of trucks in as many markets as they did last year. So out of the 20 regions, there was only 1 or 2 that were reporting a slight shortage of trucks this year. So that was produce season, and of course that's against the backdrop of, falling restaurant numbers, the Restaurant Performance Index, the RPI that comes out from the Restaurant Association. I've got the data here. I was just writing about it for next week's show, and it says that the RPI for May was down 1.3%. So that means that there are 1.3% fewer people going to restaurants than this time last month. I think that's a little bit, it's hard to get a gauge on that, because people start to switch more to, more away, less goods and more services. When you get into the summer, you've got more travel, more travel. It's more restaurants that's related to travel, as opposed to going out to your local restaurants or buying fruit and veg at the grocery store. So there's a little bit of a shift going on there. Open Table was the other data point, that I watch. Open Table are the folks that do all the restaurant bookings. So they've got a global network, and you can track the dining behavior experience of people at restaurants. For the week ending July 10, the number of seated diners in the US was 3% lower than this time last year. So
and that's a huge number.
Yeah, it's a big number. And the Tindex from Technomics, they cover food and bev as well as restaurants. So what you get is a bit more of the food services sector as well as restaurant. And it's a different packaging requirement between the two. The food services is up 2.4% year over year. So restaurants are down a little bit, but food services is up. So there's a little bit of a shift going on. And I think that's fairly normal for this time of the year as we switch to a different type of consumer behavior once we get into the holidays. So that's where we sit on that front. Produce season, everything else is pretty flat. Dry band's pretty flat to maybe slightly down. We're seeing very low volumes in flatbed. In fact, this week, we've talked about load to truck ratio. It's one of the best predictors of spot rate directionality there is in the market, and that's independently validated by people like Jason Miller. We are seeing the lowest load to truck ratios in the last 7 or 8 years this week.
Really?
Yeah, like really, really low. Like, so just incredible, like the lowest in flatbed. Flatbed is just super, super quiet at the moment. And which sort of leads us to the discussion we were having off air. Imports are up, right? So imports are up about 2%. Of course, they're down compared to last year. But as we did with last month's numbers, I went back and looked at June in the last 5 or 6 years and said, so what was June in those pre-pandemic years? This month's or last month's numbers were 7% higher than the pre-pandemic Junes. So we're still bringing in a lot of stuff. The shift from east to west seems to have slowed dramatically. Jeff, I'd love to get your take on this, because I suspect, and you and I alluded to this, I suspect as intermodal rates crashed and capacity loosened and we had lots of empty 53s and congestion went away, I think shippers just said, heck, let's just drive volume through Los Angeles now instead of sending it through the Panama Canal to get cheaper freight. So we're seeing the West Coast pick up and the East Coast fall away. Now, we're not back to pre-pandemic levels but you can definitely see that things have come back a bit. No other big data points in the on the import front. Los Angeles is still number one. We're running at about, it's a pretty healthy number coming in May. If you read the Global Port Tracker that came out this week from the National Retail Federation, they were talking about August being the peak this year. When you look at 2.2 million TEU in June, we're certainly on track for August being the peak. Excuse me, because then you get into back to school, back to college, Halloween, and then you're into retail season.
So, Dean, I got a couple of questions, because you mentioned something that kind of piqued my interest. Do you see Mexico becoming more and more reliable for produce because of standard weather conditions, maybe not as many storms and issues that we've seen in some of the produce states? Okay.
I think so, Dan, but I think security is the bigger issue there.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Organized crime and security, because if you've read the stories about the poor avocado farmers, it's just like, it's hard enough as it is without having
I haven't. What's the stories about the avocado farmers?
Modes being taken, stolen, commandeered, held hostage.
Okay.
Yeah, lots of
kind of like old school when we first started to go into Mexico, where we'd lose trailers as grow-ops. They'd bury them.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I think there's a bit of instability
we're talking
there.
decades ago, but I remember when the first, it used to be transloading at the border. Like, very few companies, I think Celadon, correct me if I'm wrong, Jen, but I think Celadon was the first company that was able to bring their trailers into Mexico and get them out without getting them ripped off. I mean, I'm sure some did. If I remember correctly, Celadon was the first major company to say, "Hey, let's do this." But I remember it was always transloading at the border, and it would be a Mexican truckload company that would put it into their truck, or else you'd you can consider your trailer gone.
They will continue to be a solid partner of ours. So I don't think they'll overcome it. They'll find a way to work around that. But the fact they were able to ramp up volumes so much this year to fill that void, I think that's a really good story.
Yeah, I used Celadon when I was, ironically enough, down in McAllen and Los Indios, Texas. And I believe you're right, Dan, that Celadon was the one that was going into Mexico, because at the time Panasonic was in Tijuana. And and I believe that they were the first ones in there. But I was lucky enough I didn't have those problems, knock on wood, but others did.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dean, you'll probably know, I think Challenger was the first Canadian carrier that did Mexico direct. If I'm not mistaken, either the first one or the first one I heard about of a Canadian carrier that did Mexico direct without transloading. But anyways. I think they were, because I know Challenger has kind of always Dan has made sure that Challenger always sat at the forefront of all of these things, right? But interesting, I love the fact that it's like other people, obviously, except overseas, stepped up to help with produce, because it's I think it's important that it's done via truck instead of overseas, because it can ripen longer. There's not that time delay, right? Whereas I've noticed produce starting to taste better lately. And then my second question was, I don't know about you guys, but for the month of June, I found that my wife and I stopped going to restaurants as much and started barbecuing more, because the weather finally picked up. The nice weather was here. I'm noticing our barbecues, like, we're going through propane way faster than most years. And I'm wondering if that has, and I'm wondering if that has something to do with the restaurants, right? Because
absolutely,
we're purchasing from different locations. Prior to that, we were going out at least once a week to a restaurant.
Right.
At least. And now it's, once every 3 weeks, 2 weeks, maybe, instead of once or twice a week, because of barbecue season, right? As we love grill. You guys love grill, like grilling food.
Absolutely. I grill during the week. And we go to a restaurant just to change it up every weekend. Different restaurants and stuff.
Date night kind of thing for you, Jeff, right?
Yeah. What's that?
Date night for you, kind of thing, like
to break up the week and get out of Dodge. Go see something new.
So Dan, let me wrap up produce season with some numbers, because I think this because what I want to try and get to is to the fun discussion about the LTL market, which when you sit where we're sitting right now, remember we talked about some massive geopolitical risk or some massive event that could upend the market. Well, we're on the precipice of something like that potentially happening, even though it's the likelihood of it's fairly low as you would think, but who knows what's going to happen in this market. So produce season was more of a speed bump when we think about the spike in rates that happens. Normally, if dry van rates would go up 19 cents a mile, they went up 11 this produce season. Reefer rates would normally go up 25 cents a mile between mid-April and July 4. They went up this year by 16. So it was, they did go up, but they didn't. They're kind of in between where you'd normally expect last year and where you'd normally expect them to be. So not a bad year for carriers in general. And I think brokers were able to find the capacity they needed to move loads. We weren't hearing any ridiculous pricing. So what that leads us into, this is the important part of the discussion for anybody thinking about buying capacity right now, is this last weekend was the peak in spot rates for dry van and reefer. Right? Doesn't matter how far you go back, it always peaks on July 4. And for the next 140 some odd days, the rates generally cool off and decrease until you get into the holiday season. So now that's different to flatbed. Flatbed will be driven by hurricane season and some other things that could happen as we get further in the year. But reefer and dry van, it's a bit of a slow grind from now on. And if you saw our show yesterday, our 35-day forecast has rates dropping by about 5 cents a mile over the next month. So that's an important number, because we've been saying that spot rates have bottomed out. If they go back to 5 cents a mile, they're still going to be about where they've been for the last 8 weeks. And I've always contended that spot rates are going to be pretty flat by the time we get to year end, as in they'll be about where we are now by the time we get through the end of the year. So why that's an important number, if rates generally do decrease after the July 4, then what does that do to carrier viability? And the thing is, if diesel keeps dropping by 2 or 3 cents a gallon per week, and even if rates drop a bit, carriers can still hang in there. And we won't see that massive change in capacity that'll flip the market. So as we normally go through this third quarter, I don't see any major change in the freight market. We've always contended that it'll be a very tepid spot market before contract rates start to pick up. Our theory's always been that that'll be in the fall before you see this market inflection, where enough capacity has left the industry and demand starts to increase in the fall, and then we're into the next freight cycle. So that's where we sit right now. And that brings us to the potential for the market to be turned on its head in the event that one of these large LTL companies, of course, Yellow is the first one that's had a little bit of a reprieve, but that one's a big one. And of course, the other one is UPS and the Teamsters, that negotiation, neither of which are a easy thing to handle from a truckload perspective, right? When you think about moving that freight, because it's not just the line haul component, it's the P&D component, the pickup and delivery component, right down to the driver on a new route finding a new doorman, or where the keys are to the forklift, or what time they go to lunch. All of these really soft things have to be figured out, and it'll be very, very disruptive. So I don't have a silver ball, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what that looks like. But Ken Adamo had a good piece this morning in, was it Supply Chain? Fleet Owner. And he worked, right on cue. And what Ken worked at FedEx for many years, so he has a lot of deep experience when it comes to LTL. His view is that if we don't see any significant movement between the parties by this Friday shippers will be starting to move their freight across to truckload, because that's 2 weeks out from when the deadline is on the UPS side. And we saw the same thing. If you remember back to the only time I can give you a similar scenario was with the September 16 railroad stoppage. I think it was September 16 last year. We talked to another off the rails 14 days out from September 16. They were already pulling volume off the intermodal network and putting it on truckload. So sometime in that 2 week to 7 day period out from that date, you'll start to see freight move. The interesting thing back in September was that the contract freight market absorbed that overflow freight because the contract market still had plenty of capacity. And I suspect the contract market probably has some capacity right now to absorb any overflow LTL freight that gets into the truckload market. So I'm going to pause there because I've rattled on here for long enough, but these are some pretty precarious times that we're in, especially when you think about the West Coast ports are on strike for the second week in British Columbia. That's going to start to have an effect because they run, I think it's 4 trains a day off Prince Rupert's on-dock rail to Chicago. So a lot of Midwest freight comes from British Columbia because it's closer to China than
the Eastern freight that comes across Canada. All of it comes from
exactly. So you've got Toronto, you've got Chicago. Yeah, it's going to be very disruptive. It's about 8% of total volume, Dan. Like it's not. I mean, that's an average. It's not a huge number, but it's significant. It's enough to make a significant dent, I think, in supply chains.
Huge. Yeah, definitely. I mean, especially for you look at smaller companies in Canada.
Right.
And we've always, as a Canadian who's in logistics, I speak to U.S. companies all the time where they're like, yeah, Canada's a pretty small market. It's about 8%. We only do about 10 loads a week there. And I remember as a beginning sales rep, I was like, 10 loads a week? You do 10 loads a week here? Like, that's huge volume. But from a U.S. corporation perspective, that's fairly small volume. But I look at it and I say, you know what, 8%, Dean, that's massive.
Right.
Every single person that orders from overseas comes into BC.
Right.
Like very few have gone East Coast.
Right.
Even during the pandemic, it was all BC. And when we had the mudslides that took out highways in BC, when we had the train stop because of fires in BC, all of these things had a huge ripple effect on the East Coast. Anything east of BC. I had some guys picking up at the ports trucking freight to Saskatchewan instead of train, which caused huge issues. We had farmers in Saskatchewan trucking freight to BC. Like the numbers were outrageous at a cost level as opposed to rail, right? Now with it being on strike, they can't even get it. So it's impacting everything from the port back, right?
Yeah.
And so it's huge. And the ripples, like that tsunami is on its way.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's coming in and it's growing bigger and bigger every day. And this brings me to a point that I wanted to make sure I got across. A couple of weeks back, I don't know if you guys remember, but I was like, you know what? The government always step in. And Dean and you and I were texting about this the other day. And I was wrong. The government didn't step in. And I swore they were going to. Like I swear, like you can't let the largest port in Canada shut down. Like you did, in my head, I'm going, you can't, after COVID and after all of this, the Canadian government saw what it did, the amount of money the Canadian government put out, the amount of companies that can't pay their taxes because their volume in sales is so low. Like it all rolls, like, as they say, the proverbial shit rolls downhill, right? And you would think they would step in with the rail strike, like governments, like people, the California last year or 2 years ago when Biden stepped in, like all of these things. And I was blown away. So to everyone where I was so dead set on, it's BS. It's never going to happen. I apologize. I was totally wrong there, guys. And I'm actually very surprised that the Canadian government hasn't stepped in. Very surprised because I also think there's a precedent that's been set now because they actually went on strike. And like, if you think about the volume and the money that's gone into thin air, and it's money for governments too. right? Like if you got to think, if it doesn't land, there's no taxes and there's no duties on it, right? Like, I don't know. I'm blown away by that. Now, when it comes to yellow, I know there's and UPS, there's big things there. My question was, do you guys think? Okay, so let's project forward. Let's say yellow does go under. Do you not think they'll be bought pretty quick?
So there's property, so there's land, right? So think about what's for sale. There could be land, there could be trucks, trailers, maybe some forklifts, dock equipment, things like that. But if you think about, if you think about what is the most valuable piece of that is the freight volume, which you would theoretically absorb into your own network, because I have to think that all of the LTL carriers, these national carriers, have the same footprint, as in their route networks overlap. So yeah, you might need some more equipment, but I would think if you were doing it, you'd be wanting to absorb that new volume into your existing network. Now there'll be some pain digesting that initially, but that's what you'd be wanting to do without just going out and buying all of the equipment. I don't know you'd want to buy all of the equipment.
Yeah, little history about that, and I've already been telling my clients don't use them. I'm just being very blunt on it, because I go back to the days of St. Johnsbury and what they did. They had 52 terminals on the East Coast. Now, just keep in mind that Yellow throughout the country has 300 cross-dock terminals that are out there. Okay, when St. Johnsbury closed, I told my clients at that time, very long time ago, move your freight. Don't do it. And some were like, no, the prices are great, whatever. Well, to make a long story short, when they said, don't worry about it, everything's going to be delivered, we're going to cease pickups. That didn't happen. And they closed the gates and locked freight at their terminals for 6 months. Talk about a headache. It was unbelievable. 6 months, and we're going back.
Now, they did that, Jeff, because of the receivership, like to figure out, like, right, like everything. So for everybody that's watching that doesn't know who St. Johnsbury is, we're an LTL carrier on the East Coast, right? Like kind of like a Yellow Freight on the East Coast, correct?
Huge.
Yeah. So was it like kind of everything gets locked down until we sort things out and figure out what's what?
Nope, they just closed it down. That was it. That was the end of business. That was the end of business. So what's been going on? Just think about this, and that's why I'm very hesitant and playing it very down for Yellow. Now, the problem they have right now has been going on for decades. They sold a terminal in Tannersville, PA, for $117 million to cut debt well over a decade ago. They've been in debt, for a very, very, very long time. They're in debt for $1.3 or $1.4 billion. That's a B, folks. That's not an M. Okay. All right. So they, over that time, you figure the reason why they sold off assets was to reduce their debts and pay it off. That didn't happen. It actually increased. Okay. And we're going back to the time when Zolars was the head of Yellow. They had Roadway, New Penn, RPS, if you remember that FedEx bought as well. All these things happen. Now, what's going to happen when they close their door? This is a Band-Aid. I don't think, and I kept on saying this, I don't know how they're going to survive this, because whoever buys them out is going to be stuck with $1.4 billion of debt. All right. That a lot of people failed to realize that. And also, when I did the analysis way back when they were truckload and LTL, we're talking over 1 billion pounds of freight instantaneously hitting the market. That's over 1 billion pounds. Okay. I don't care how much capacity you have out there. It's going to come to a standstill, because when they close their door and they say, don't worry about it, we'll worry about it. We're afraid all of this. You're talking about a union that's pissed off right now. Do you think that they're going to finish delivering their goods? I say not. I say that whenever they close their doors, that their trucks are going to be sitting there. the freight's going to be sitting there and it won't be delivered. So
Right.
Probably leave half their drivers stranded, like Celadon and all that, right? Like the fuel card just got cut off.
Look, you got 22,000 union members that are working for Yellow right now. They are unhappy and they're willing to give up their jobs. That's how steadfast they are about this increase that they want and the negotiations. I've said it many times and I was wrong. When I thought they were going to go downhill, they somehow got lifted up, but I just can't see them coming out of this. You know,
but did they really, Jeff? Because if they're continuing to get more debt, I think they're just buying their time more than getting lifted.
That's it. But but how long is that time going to extend for?
Hell, Uber still hasn't made any money.
You want to take the chance because of good rates to continue to ship with them and take that risk. And what does that risk mean to you and your customers? You know, that's the thing. And there's been a lot. I've been reading a lot about this and having that past history and following it. There's a lot of customers out there that are thinking just the way that I'm doing, and they're starting to move that freight. But it's going to be a huge disruption, Dean and Dan. I mean,
and that's why
£1 billion of freight hitting the market overnight.
Well, that's why their competitors are demanding a multi-year contract right now. So they're talking. You know, we had a guest on our show yesterday from the LTL industry, and they're talking about starting to get some incoming calls for quotes. We already know that some of the big competitors of Yellow are already saying to customers, "Hey, if you want to come on board, let's talk multi-year contracts." So that's why this becomes a devastating outcome, is because a lot of that volume never comes back, even if they do survive. But the closer you get to that deadline, the more volume that has disappeared in the long term. And I think
the more money you lose, and the further you get in debt, the more you kind of put the nails in your coffin, right? Like it's.
Yeah, so that one's a pretty big deal. That one there, the UPS one's a big deal. The last one was 1997, according to our notes here. I wasn't in the country at that time, so I actually can't even speak to what that was like. I only read about it from the news.
Yeah, it's they need those customers to stay afloat, and if they're losing their customers, their debt is only going to increase and get deeper. So I mean, I don't know. I just can't see it.
And if you look at what both of you guys just said, Dean, the data that Dean has says that 14 days, kind of 2 weeks to 3 weeks, everybody started pulling freight off the rail and putting it in the truckload market. You think about how long some of those trips are for Yellow to get your LTL from California to New Jersey. Like, it's not a 2-day trip. It's you're 10, 12 days to get it on an LTL with a Yellow company.
And 6 touch points.
Yeah, like a minimum, I think. And and it's as a shipper, this because you understand the hub and spoke network, right? As a shipper, and even if you're using Yellow Direct, if you're on any of those boards where you kind of type in your information and you got Yellow and all the different common LTL carriers that move the freight, I'm wondering how long they've stayed away from it.
Right.
Just because if something does go sour instantly, they've now opened up the exposure to their network and to their customers.
Right.
And if it would take it a step further, I think the pandemic has also shown a lot of customers, who are paying attention to the market and saying, okay, I buy your product and you ship with Yellow. You better not ship with Yellow anymore, because we've seen what happens when there's delays in logistics. Because Ryan and I were talking yesterday, and the conversation came up where, in earnings reports, up before pre-pandemic, very few companies, if any, besides Amazon, talked about logistics as a KPI. Right now, almost every earning report call has logistics as a KPI on the call, and so the mentality's changed, and I think personally, I agree with both of you, and I think it's going to become a much bigger. Okay, how financially stable is this company when they go to bring a carrier in? And even when switching LTL companies, I wouldn't be surprised. And Dean, I'd love if you could ask the gentleman that was on your show yesterday for LTL, do they find more people asking about credentials, financial credentials, like, sustainability of the company. How, are you good? I don't know it. If I was a shipper, I think that would be one of my biggest questions right now. Is, okay, I'm going to use you, but are you going to be here in a year?
Yeah, I'm sure it's a question. The Dayton Freight Lines we had on our show yesterday have been around for decades, so I don't know. People would insult their intelligence. Yeah, they're a incredibly profitable, well-run, solid, cultured company that's non-unionized. They've got nearly 70 terminals now in the Midwest. That's a successful company at the regional LTLs. So, the other thing I want to mention is that, and you might know better than I, Jeff, but UPS, I was told, was the largest customer on the intermodal network.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, UPS is up there. I know at one time they were like 90% during the peak season, holiday season.
Right.
That it was very, very difficult to stop a train. And, when you go up to Global One up in Chicago, which is a main hub up there, during the holidays, a train has to be filled to a certain percentage before they start rolling. But when UPS is on that, nothing stops that train. It needs to get to its final destination. But if you're a normal shipper and you're shipping there and there's not too many UPSs, they'll hold it there until that train meets that 90% criteria before it rolls. So it's they do pretty much own them.
So I guess my point there is that because of the lead time in positioning containers and getting trains moving and getting freight to the train and all the dray moves on and off at each point, you've probably got a longer lead time if you're a shipper, right, in making that switch away from because if you're thinking about that UPS business model, if you're now we're 2 weeks out from July 31, you'd have to be thinking right now about, do I put this on a train? Because if things do go south, then whatever I ship today is going to get caught up.
Yeah. Is it actually going to move? Is it going to sit somewhere for weeks until they get the volume to move it? It's
I said it all the time, gentlemen. I've said it all the time, and you could go back to past podcasts. You always got to look at the what-if scenarios proactively to get yourself set in case something goes south. Don't be in that reactive mindset, because if you are, you're too late. You missed the boat, and you're going to lose a tremendous amount of money, both on the broker side, the shipper side. You got to start thinking of alternatives and options during this time right now. Don't wait until tomorrow. Start doing it now, with the mindset that this is going to happen. How am I going to react? Who am I going to call? How am I going to do it? When and why? You really need to do that. Don't hesitate. Don't wait.
It brings up a pretty interesting point, because how one impacts the other, right? You think of UPS, supply chain solution, UPS, and you think of, they're an LTL carrier there as well as a package carrier. Even with my tenure, I never thought of what Dean just brought up about how much volume they put on the rail.
Yeah.
So if I was a rail, if I manufactured product and put it on rail, Dean was having some internet issues today, I guess, because he froze there before, Jeff? It'd be interesting, because I don't know if I would think of UPS's union issues as a rail issue.
Right.
Because and so it's that we're just waiting for Dean. There it is. So it's that that's okay, brother. It's that I think your volume's messed up though, Dean.
Okay, hold on.
Can you hear us?
Hang on.
Oh, yeah, there you go. No, you're back. You're back.
I gotcha.
So it's interesting, because you sit there and you maybe use rail, but you don't understand that your rail might be impacted by a company like UPS, who you perceive to be an LTL and package carrier, utilizing those rail services. So that integration is huge. And if you're a broker, start having, pay attention to what was just said by these two gentlemen, because that's critical. Now you have that, and I'm going to say ammunition. I don't know if it's the right word, but I'm going to say you have that knowledge. I think that's a better use of verbiage. that knowledge to go back to your customer and say, hey, do you do this? Because if you do this, just understand this. If this happens, this is kind of that ripple effect, right? And it's throwing a rock in a pond. And which when you throw a rock in a pond and those waves, no matter what size, hit the shore, understand what each of those waves are.
Yeah. And another thing to follow up on that is as a shipper, when they do optimization, they'll get the LTL shipment from customer A in the morning, and then customer A calls in the afternoon with a few UPS packages or whatever, and then you consolidate that and you build it upon the LTL shipment because you've got a dedicated LTL carrier showing up, banging at your dock at 4:00 every afternoon. What are you going to do with that? I mean, just imagine. So you're using yellow. Yellow goes out, right? It goes on strike. Now you got 2 stones against you. What are you going to do? How are you going to switch that over from your small packages, your LTL provider being yellow? How are you going to do that transfer from that LTL, the optimization plus the UPS? I mean, how are you going to do that? Are you thinking of that? Or are you risking it all and saying, it's not going to happen? No worries. But
all I can say is I hope you weren't hit in the head as a baby, because you need to put that puzzle together real quick.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Hey, Dan.
I hope we weren't.
Hey, Dan. We need a new segment on the show. Remember Chris Berman would say on ESPN, let's go to the videotape?
Yeah, let's go to the videotape.
Whenever Jeff says, I said this on the show 6 months ago, we need to go. Let's go to the videotape.
Let's go. Yeah, and pull up what he said.
Because,
yeah,
and it's not just Jeff. I swear that some of the things I say, I know I've said it, but I can't remember when. And I just hope it wasn't last week.
No.
That was far enough.
I can tell you one thing for Data Day, guys. I look at it and I think some of the things we talked about last February.
Right. Oh yeah.
Sorry, let me rephrase that. The majority of things we talked about last February have happened.
Yep.
I think we were off maybe a handful of times, handful of times. Yeah. We were off maybe. Stop hitting babies, Dan. Nice, Ryan. And so, I like that one. Thanks, brother. But it's we are going to have to do that. We're going to have to start figuring that out and doing. But with AI now, we can actually type in a phrase and it'll find it in the video. So we'll have to do that. But gentlemen, we got to get moving today.
Right.
Thank you so much for being here. I mean, that conversation alone is worth millions to people that are listening and digging into the data. For everybody watching, listen, head over to YouTube, subscribe to our channel. I didn't upload that new banner that Ryan gave me, which is my bad. I apologize. Head over to YouTube, subscribe to the channel. Guys, just listen. This episode alone gives you so many different tools and strategies to start thinking outside the box and what you, as a logistics provider, as the person that helps your customers get their product to market, what we need to be thinking about. Till next time, remember, go out there, make every call educational, crush your sales, my friends, and thank you for watching Sales Chatter. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Have a great day, folks.
Yep.